literary critics like myself live in a kind of permanent state of dread, fear that one day some minor clerk in a government office, idly leafing through documents, will stumble on the shameful truth that we're actually paid to read poems, novels, and plays. Struck by the fact that this is every bit as scandalous as being paid for having sex, or sunbathing, eating chocolate, or whatever it may be, Clark will throw himself on the phone and blow to his superiors and blow the whistle on the lotteries. Erstwhile specialists on Jane Austen will be turned into pig farmers, the rest of us will be shipped out in trucks to the countryside to do a spot of unaccustomed and hard labour. The truth, in other words, will finally be out, the shameful truth that studying literature is far too pleasurable a pursuit to count as a kosher discipline. But the scandal isn't only that we're paid for reading poems, plays and novels, for doing things that other people do anyway. The scandal, even more outrageously, we're paid for reading books about people who never existed and events that never took place. In everyday life, talking about imaginary people is known as psychosis. In universities, it's known as literary criticism. Quantum physicists work on entities that may or may not exist, and so do theologians. There are debates among sociologists about whether, say, the Bank of England exists in the same sense that banknotes do, or whether it's just a fictional name for an assemblage of people and desks and filing cabinets and so on. Mathematicians of a Platonic turn of mind claim that numbers are somehow out there, along with Charlie Sheen and the Empire State Building and so on, whereas for other mathematicians, numbers are no more out there than the concept of crimson is. Even, I suppose, maverick archaeologists who work on the lost city of Atlantis, or astrophysicists who speculate that there may be an infinity of universes, each of them, if we're unlucky, with its own Charlie Sheen, they, who knows, may just be onto something, but we, alas, are onto nothing. There never was anyone called Emma Woodhouse or Emma Bovary, and particularly cruel twist this, even if there were, it would make no difference to the kind of things we say about them, for literary theoretical reasons too tedious to enter into here. Critics don't have the satisfaction of working on things that indubitably exist, like sick dogs or dental cavities, so we're tempted to pluck a virtue out of necessity, tough it out, and argue that working on things that don't exist is an altogether superior pursuit. And this word is known as the creative imagination. Creative imagination is one of those phrases which almost everyone on the planet seems to regard as unequivocally positive, like, have another Guinness. Let's shoot the Duke of Edinburgh. Well, everybody but me, I suppose. I don't share this unqualified enthusiasm for the creative imagination, since it's surely clear, isn't it, that the imagination can dream up all kinds of dark and disease scenarios, as well as all kinds of life-giving ones. Serial killing, for example, requires quite a lot of imagination, so a friend tells me. You were supposed to laugh there, but quite warmed up at that point. Literary critics, of course, commend the imagination as a kind of spiritual prosthesis, a sort of extension of one's experience, a way of experiencing things that otherwise we couldn't. If you live in Indiana and you don't have the money to fly to Korea, then you can always read about the country instead in some exciting fictional form. Indeed, for some seriously bizarre theorists, this is even more real than visiting the country itself. And this then distracts us from the question of why some people can't afford to travel to Korea, and other people have enough money to buy the place up several times over. In other words, literature, the imagination, creativity, as compensating us for our deficiencies, yes, as amplifying, intensifying, extending our experience in ways that then might mean that we feel no need to do anything about those deficiencies for real. What sort of society is it, you might ask, in which the possible, imaginary, is always thought to be superior to the actual? I mean, what kind of comment does that make on the actual? I mean, every lethal invention on record came about through the creative imagination, through the realizing the previously unenvisaged possibilities. If William Blake ranks among the great visionaries, so does Joseph Stalin. It's surely no accident that in England, this theory of the creative imagination is twinned at birth with the emergence of industrial capitalism. The two things are really born at a stroke. At this turbulent historical point, the lives of many millions of men and women involved in various rather back-breaking kinds of labour did indeed seem to need a little creative supplementing, and the creative imagination is accordingly, as it were, rolled on stage. In fact, the doctrine, of course, goes back before Romanticism. It goes back at least to the 18th century, where the imagination first emerges as a kind of compensation for what's felt to be the natural selfish individualism of human beings. I mean, if all I can really know in a good old empiricist lineage is my own sense impressions, then how can I ever really come to know you other than as a shape on my eyeballs? Aren't we forever cut off from each other by the thick walls of our bodies? Well, mine are rather thick, I don't want to keep that necessarily to everyone in the room. If that is the case, if one sees senses as enclosing us in some way that hampers fluid communication between us, then maybe there's the need for some sort of mysterious, quirky, enigmatic, intuitive faculty which allows me to range beyond my senses, project myself beyond my body, and into, as it were, the emotional interior of someone else, so that I can empathize with what you're feeling. And this mysterious faculty is known, among other things, well, it has several names in the 18th century, moral sense, for example, but certainly the imagination. The imagination is what compensates here for our natural indifference to one another. It's the other face of a certain possessive individualism. Let's begin with what a strange idea of the human body this entails. The body is seen as something which walls us off from others, something within which the real me is lurking, but is hard to break through. But a body surely isn't a way of being shut off from the world. On the contrary, a body is a way of being in the world. It's a project amidst things. It's a way of communicating with others. It's a traffic with reality. It's the way one can be vitally present to others and to the world. I'm not inside my body as somebody might be inside a truck or inside a train. On the contrary, my body just is my expressive mode of being in the world. Think as an analogy of having a language. Yes, I mean, to have a language, to be, as it were, on the inside of a language, is simply by virtue of that to belong to a world, to belong to something more than language, because language opens up that world so that, as it were, to be inside it is simultaneously to be on the outside of it, or rather, perhaps better, this whole rather misleading inside-outside duality falls to the ground. Ludwig Wittgenstein once asked his philosophical colleagues why, he said, why do people speak about the external world? He professed himself to be puzzled, bemused by the phrase, the external world. And of course he was quite right to be so. I mean, external to what? Certainly not to us, unless you think of us as secreted, lurking somewhere within our bodies, so that everything seems on the outside to us. We are actually in the midst of the world, alongside the world, not in any sense external to it. Thomas Aquinas, probably, I suppose, the greatest theologian who ever wrote, apart from Paul and Augustine, even refused to give the word body to a corpse. It's very interesting, isn't it? The effect of a long Cartesian tradition, that when we hear the phrase, the body is the library, the last thing we think of is an assiduous reader. We think of a corpse. The word body has come to mean corpse, partly through the damage of a very long dualistic and Cartesian tradition, whereas Aquinas, who predates all that, and who in his own way is a kind of materialist, refuses to then give the word body about a corpse. He calls a corpse the remains of a body, because for him a body just is something alive, communicative, self-transcendent, relational, and so on. It would be odd, wouldn't it? It would be possible to ring somebody up and say, is George there? And they say, yes, but he's asleep. But not, is George there? Yes, but he's dead. Aquinas believed in immortal souls, but he wouldn't have thought that the soul of Michael Jackson, if indeed he had one, which is a matter of metaphysical debate among scholars, the soul of Michael Jackson was Michael Jackson. Michael certainly thought that Michael Jackson's soul was Michael Jackson is bodily, was a bodily phenomenon. Let me return now to the idea of the empathetic imagination. The idea here is that if only I could get past the walls of my own body, the way I'm enclosed in my own essentially private senses, and project myself into you, into your emotional innards, as it were, then I can feel what you are feeling, and I'm therefore more likely to behave compassionately to you. This is quite an old literary belief that survives at least as late as George Eliot, where the imagination is in that sense a moral faculty, yes, as well as an aesthetic one, but not, I think, as late as, say, Thomas Mann. You cease to be a mere object on my horizon, so the theory goes, and instead become a co-subject. But what about, for example, a sadist who needs to know what his victim is feeling in order to enjoy pain? A sadist doesn't need to know what his victim is feeling to stop torturing his victim. On the contrary, knowing what someone is feeling by the power of the empathetic imagination won't necessarily at all change the way you behave towards them. In fact, I may need to know how you're feeling in order to exploit or oppress you more effectively. There is, in fact, a rather strange theory that the Victorian or the 19th century needed a mode of knowledge of those darker areas of the society which were unknown to their reason, to their rationality, slums and the underbelly of society. They needed a mode of knowledge in order, as it were, to control this more effectively, and the name of that mode of knowledge was the novel. Paranoid. But there is something to be said for paranoia from time to time. It wasn't that the Nazis couldn't imagine how the Jews of Auschwitz were feeling. They didn't care how they were feeling. I can rescue you from being chewed by a shark, for example, without the slightest idea of what being chewed by a shark feels like. It doesn't matter. Indeed, morality has very little to do with feeling, very little to do with heart, as they say. Virtue is a social practice. In the first place, it's not a disposition of the heart. I don't have to feel your pain in order to cure it. In fact, feeling it might get in the way of my cure it. Ludwig Wittgenstein, once again, once said, love is not a feeling. What on earth did you mean? Should he not just have got out a bit more? Around the place? Well, I take it, I take it he wasn't talking about romantic or erotic love, of course, feelings, states of experience, but he was talking about love in the authentic sense, namely not all of this romantic and erotic stuff which has narrowed and degraded the meaning of the word love over so many centuries, but agape, caritas, which is a matter of what you do. And what you're feeling is neither here nor there. Love is not a feeling. Even sexual relationships are, for the most part, a matter of talking. Or am I missing out? We think of the creative imagination, don't we, as we're surrounded by a certain aura, among the most noble and highest faculties. Yet, the imagination is akin to fantasy, which we know to be one of the most regressive and infantile of human activities. Poets are just those rather strange adults who never cease to relish the infantile delights of babbling, yes, to draw some libidinal pleasure from all this lip-smacking activity, this mouth music, as Seamus Heaney called it. Infants delight in language for its own sake, and so do poets, unlike, say, bureaucrats, who don't delight in language for their own sake at all. In that sense, then, one of the most apparently advanced of human activities is unnervingly close to one of the most babyish. And the same goes for sexuality, which Freud taught us is not where we're most adult and mature. There is no concept of maturity in Freud, but where we are most childlike. Sexuality is where we're most childlike. We are all victims of a terrible catastrophe from which none of us really entirely recovers, known as infancy. Well, if there are problems with the creative imagination, it could be because the criticism is in need of some rather less dubious rationale than this, though of course one might always ask why reading poems and plays and novels should need any more justification than sunbathing or sex or eating chocolate. Isn't the whole point of the arts, an interesting radical romantic theory of them, that they're gloriously pointless? Isn't that the whole point? Yes. Isn't their most precious value in a social order for which everything must have a use, and anything which doesn't have a use is worthless? Isn't that their most precious value? There is a long and honourable romantic radical tradition which holds exactly this, that capitalist civilizations work predominantly in terms of utility, exchange value, instrumental rationality, and so on, means to ends thinking. The bone-headed Philistines who now run our educational institutions globally, think only in those terms. A few months ago I was being shown around what I was told was the largest university in Asia, in South Asia, in Korea, a very proud vice-chancellor who was showing me his business school and managerial centre and so on. He was flanked by two sort of minders, two young, heavy-looking men in dark suits. I don't know whether they had Kalashnikovs under their jackets, but they might. And I said to him, well, but there seems to be no kind of critical activity around here. He looked at me wonderingly as though I said, how many PhDs in pole dancing? And said in a rather strangulated voice, your comment will be noted. I don't like the sound of that at all. Whereupon he pulled some gleaming little piece of technology out of his pocket and said into it a few words, probably killed him. Or being swept off by his minders in a limousine about the length of a football pitch. And that, of course, is the way education, do I need to tell you, the way education is today. To that extent, activities which seem to exist purely for their own self-delight delight, which are in the jargon autotelic, which have their ends only in themselves, are something of a scandal, certainly something of a luxury, service. The order of boneheaded Philistines who we labour under don't like things that seem to exist purely for their own self-delight, though they do quite often claim strangely to believe in God, who of course is the paradigmatic case of a being who is thought traditionally to have his means, ends, grounds, and purposes entirely in himself, and to exist, to use a technical theological term, just for the hell of it. To that extent, if that's true, if that's the way to see art, then it exists as a critique of our everyday instrumental social practices, not so much by what it says, not so much by its content, but simply by virtue of the rather curious, mysterious thing that it is, the way in which, as for the radical romantics, it seems to keep conjuring itself up effortlessly and spontaneously out of its own unfathomable being, obedient to no law but its own, obedient to no heteronymous authority, faithful tenaciously only to the law of its own being. And for that kind of tradition, the point is that art in doing that provides an image of how we too might be, how men and women might exist in a social order, less obsessed by instrumental rationality, ends, means, causality, exchange value, functionality, and so on. To adapt a phrase of Freud's, where art was, there shall humanity be. That's the promise of a certain, rather perhaps idealist, but nonetheless, I think very generous-spirited romantic tradition. In fact, this pretty well, I suppose, is the whole of the social vision of Karl Marx, who was a good old romantic humanist as well as an enlightenment rationalist, rather a powerful combination between both an enlightenment rationalist and a romantic humanist. Marx wanted a society in which the realization and expansion of human powers and capacities could be a creative and delightful end in itself. That's the whole of Marx's ethics, you might say. Not as a means to power or profit or utility of some kind. And indeed, when Marx comes to look for an image of production, he thinks not about coal mines or steel mills, he thinks about art, because for him, art is the paradigm of that kind of creative self-realization purely for its own sake. There are only two good reasons, really, in my view, for being a Marxist. One is just to annoy people who don't like it. Bump into them at sherry parties, you know. And the second, of course, is because you don't like working. Anybody who doesn't like doing the work should sign on straight away. Because, of course, Marxism is not about labour, it's about leisure. Yes? It's about trying, if Marx was so concerned with the economic, which he resented very much because he couldn't then write his big book on Balzac, it was because he wished to diminish the tyranny of the economic over human lives. Yes? Nobody, he once said, has written so much about money and had so little. Marx looks forward to a society where, as far as feasible, men and women could be released from the curse of drudgery. We live within the most fabulously accumulated wealth that human history has ever known, in the midst of which there is utter poverty and destitution, and Marx's only real question is how come, what are the mechanisms to produce that contradiction. Oscar Wilde, who is very much a Marxist in that particular sense, Wilde also believed in a society in which, as far as possible, one could release men and women from drudgery, though his vision, well, typically was perhaps a little more flamboyant than Marx's. Yes. Wilde believed in a society where we would all sort of lie around all day in loose crimson garments, sipping absinthe, reciting Homer to each other, and that would just be the working day. If art exists for its own sake, if one takes that particular theory, then and then, ironically, is most socially potent purely by being itself, which is a strange kind of paradox, then it belongs to a very rare class of things, which are, as I say, autotelic, which have their ends and purposes in themselves. What the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, would call praxis, that's to say, that rather peculiar kind of activity which carries its means internally to itself, rather than simply being instrumental, all the way from playing chess to playing with your children, and so on. As I said before, the most important member of that autotelic class traditionally is God. God, above all, who has his origins, grounds, reasons, purposes, raison d'etre in himself, who lives entirely for his own eternal self-delight, and who has therefore no need of anything outside his own being. Which means to say that if he did create something outside his own being, us, for example, he did so not out of need, but out of love. The creation, doctrine of creation, whatever 19th century rationalists like Richard Dawkins may think, doctrine of creation has nothing whatsoever, of course, to do with how the world got started. Doctrine of creation is in no sense a kind of bogus or alternative theory of how the universe got off the ground. It's, as Aquinas and many other theologians know, it's about the fact that the universe is, as it were, the original act gratuit. That is to say, that it's purely gratuitous. The most staggering fact about everything, not least ours, is that it might just as well never have existed, and exists only as an act of love, gift, gratuity, grace. There is no necessity to the universe at all, and certainly not to Mel Gibson and Russell Crowe. Another member of the autotelic class is actually, interestingly enough, evil, on which there's a superbly attractive and very remarkably cheap book written by myself. You're supposed to laugh at that. Evil, of course, which Americans fling the word evil around extraordinarily. He was pure evil when somebody just picked up his pocket or shoplifted or something. Evil, of course, is extraordinarily rare phenomenon, and it doesn't mean really very, very bad. It's a very peculiar and special kind of badness in which you destroy something purely for the obscenely orgasmic delight of doing so. Once again, purely for the hell of it. Yes. And there's, of course, mind-warping aspect of the Holocaust is that there was not only was there no reason for it, of an instrumental kind, even if you want to make an ideological bogeyman, you don't need to murder 6 million people to do so. Not only was there no reason for it, but of course it was actually counterproductive, tied up precious resources and personnel that could have been used in the war of effort and so on. Two traditional functions of literary criticism, I think, have been fairly obvious to return to the question of criticism. Whatever else they get up to, critics inquire into the workings of language, and since, in peculiarly microcosmic, intricate sort of way, and since language is, I suppose, the major medium whereby we come into being as human subjects, that is no mean project. Yes? To attend to the texture and density and intricacy of that which makes us what we are. That's not a mean project at all. The other traditional role of criticism, however, is far more general than that. And one problem has always been how these two therefore go together, and that is to provide some sort of humane critique of a culture as a whole, of a civilization as a whole, a broadly political sort of critique. And here, as I'll say later, the role of the critic begins to merge into that of the intellectual. Now, the oldest form of literary criticism on human record had no difficulty whatsoever in bringing these two functions of criticism. Again, it was known in classical antiquity as rhetoric, and the word rhetoric today, of course, still means both the discipline study of tropes and figures, and, more broadly, the art and science of publicly persuasive speech. Criticism, then, for antiquity was both textual and political at the same time, and each really in terms of the other. It studied the strategies and devices of discourse, but it did so within a public institutional context of power. Rhetoric was a kind of meta-discourse, or discourse theory, as I suppose we might say today. And that whole conception of criticism was gradually undermined by a whole host of historical factors: the decline of oral performance with the growth of printing, the shrinking of the public sphere, the privatization of poetry, the growing suspicion in the bourgeois utilitarian age of figurative and metaphorical language. In fact, somebody once told me, though I don't know if this is true, that in the 17th century in Britain, a member of Parliament tried to get metaphor banned by accident. Surely not. Maybe it is, who knows. MPs do some pretty silly things. Gradually, then, with the evolution of bourgeois society in Europe, truth was accordingly redefined as non-performative, non-dialogical, non-affective, non-contextual, and so on, taken out of that earlier rhetorical context. In our own time, disastrously, rhetoric, the very concept of rhetoric, has declined to the point where it's come to mean bombastic or dominative or manipulative language, or indeed, as I understand, in this great country of yours, has come to mean teaching students how to put colons into their sentences.
Oh, wow.
Is rather a sad decline in the days of Cicero. Speaking of colons, a minor obsession of mine is that it's the death of the colon. I don't mean death by a colon, which I'm sure there are many learned medical articles, but the death of the phenomenon itself, which seems to have vanished almost. That's another story. Now, yes, all right, I'll cut out something. Let me just say quickly, it seems to me that almost every major moment of Western criticism, from the Enlightenment to, say, the Cambridge School of the 20th century, tries in a different way to reinvent that moment in which, as it were, the textual and political work in terms of one another, in very different ways, but nevertheless, yes. However, both functions of criticism are in big trouble at that time. Take the first one, the rhetorical or verbal one, with the gradual commodifying of experience itself under our kind of society. The danger, as Dr. Benjamin saw it, that this system would scoop out our very subjectivity, yes, plunderers of our very experience, not least, of course, of our memory. And to plunder a society of its memory is also to deprive it of the future, because, as Benjamin saw superbly, the past contains vital resources for the future, and to eradicate the past in some Philistine postmodern way is therefore to help to scupper the future. It's not, as Benjamin says, dreams of liberated grandchildren that drive men and women to revolt. It's memories of enslaved ancestors. It's not some wouldn't it be nice if utopian, it's an actual fact. With the gradual commodifying of experience, I suppose, that Benjamin feared so much, that not so much as it was the death of history, but the death of experience even, with that comes a general impoverishment of language. I live in Ireland, and I live sometime in a house near the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, a strange cliff formation. Many people, millions of people, have visited over the years. But now you actually have something known as the Giant's Causeway experience. I feel very sorry for the millions of people who visited the Giant's Causeway and never had the Giant's Causeway experience. It has all been duly packaged, commodified, and so on. And that has, of course, that general withering and impoverishment of language has a direct effect on literary criticism. I mean, in my students today, literature, in my experience, are often very adept at, spotting, let's say, an ethnic stereotype or a gender stereotype or something of the kind, but they can't, for the most part, say things like the poem's exuberant tone is curiously at odds with its shambling syntax. Most of them would be nonplussed by that kind of experience, or indeed nonplussed by the critic who remarked the passage in T.S. Eliot, there's something very sad about punctuation. Our capacity to grasp language not simply as abstract as meaning, but as force, as texture, as performance, is now gravely in peril. But so too is the other traditional function of criticism, namely the broader political one. And to grasp this, why this is so, we need to look briefly at the concept of the intellectual. Intellectual doesn't mean frightfully clever, yes. If it did, then there would be no dim-witted intellectuals, and that is far from me. There are dim intellectuals just as there are bright truck drivers. The term is a job description, not a personal commendation. It's not meant to be a compliment, like frightfully clever. It describes what you get up to, or supposedly get up to. Some people use the word intellectual to cover anybody who trades in ideas. It's an interesting definition, but I'm a little wary of that myself because you would let in academics. And in my view, academics are almost not only not intellectuals, but almost the opposite of intellectuals. I apologize to any academics. Sensibilities are being gravely wounded even as I speak. Yeah. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, because it's in the nature of academic work, isn't it, to be highly specialist. When I was a student at Cambridge a long time ago, one of my pastimes was to take down a huge book which contained the title of every doctoral thesis being performed at the university. And I used to read this for hours, just to find the most ridiculously pedantic. I think the one that won, I decided after many years, was I don't even remember what faculty it was in, some scientific faculty, but the title which was Some Aspects of the Vaginal System of the Flea. That's rather a pretty good eyesight for that. Some aspect. I like that some aspect. Kind of English modesty about that. Not some rash, megalomaniac attempt to deal with any conceivable aspect of the flea's vagina, but not as scaling down. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's what academics do. That's the kind of, I don't know all academics study fleas vaginas, but that's the kind of thing that they do. Whereas intellectuals need to be, as it were, more promiscuous conceptually. They need to move more between different disciplines. And why? Well, that leads to the second distinction between intellectuals and academics, which is that intellectuals are concerned with the bearing of ideas on society, on culture as a whole, and there's no particular reason why an academic should do that. Now, in Western civilization, the role of intellectual has shifted from one area to another. In tribal times, it belonged to the poet, the bard, who in ancient Ireland was in some ways more powerful than the monarch, the king. In classical times, it belongs to the rhetorician or the philosopher. In the Age of Enlightenment, it's the philosopher, the philosophe, the savant, who stands at the crossroads of many different kinds of conceptual traffic and who is a sort of social activist, ideologue, as well as an academic. Through the 19th century, of course, as the natural sciences become increasingly the very paradigm of knowledge, not just an area of knowledge, but the very paradigm of it. It's the scientist who moves closer to the centres of intellectual authority, and it's not really, I think, until the early 20th century that the buck passes to literary people. But for various reasons, the literary figure becomes, from about the turn of the 19th century onwards, the new paradigm of the intellectual, from Edward Wilson to Edward Said, whatever. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them has to do with the increasing importance of culture in social life as a whole, and that in particular, the birth of the so-called culture industry, that from about 1900, around 1900, at the same time as modernism is developing, not insignificantly, because the one is a reaction to the other, culture is becoming for the first time a major, large-scale industry. And so that's one reason it's increasingly important. A second reason, which can be found in an extraordinary erudite, well-written book called Culture and the Death of God, that I published just a couple of months ago. The second reason is the gradual decline, at least in Europe, not so much over here, America being a very godly place, in Europe, of the decline of religion. Culture tries unsuccessfully to stand in for a rapidly failing religion. It's one of modernity is littered with ruined surrogates for religion, all the way through, and culture is one of them. Why couldn't it stand in for religion? Because religion is by far the most tenacious, universal, persistent, widespread, deep-seated, symbolic system that humanity has ever known. Will you find it in Europe on a single cultural studies course? No. Difference between Europe and America in that respect is, whereas in this country it's still acceptable, or even acceptable for a politician to talk about God and family and this great country of ours and so on. In Europe, you would just stare at your shoes in embarrassment and wait for him to stop. As I do myself when Schoenberg comes on the radio. There's a third reason for the importance of culture, and therefore for the rejuvenation of the literary critique, which unfolded as the 20th century developed, which was that culture in the broad sense of the word, language, kinship, identity, symbol, community, history, and so on, culture in that sense of the word became so extraordinarily powerful that even today one might summarily define it as what people are prepared to kill for. Culture is what you are prepared to kill for, or die for. Now, not many people are prepared to kill for Dickens or Dostoevsky. There may be a few seriously weird people hanging out in caves somewhere, too ashamed to come out and face the rest of us, who are prepared to kill for Dostoevsky. But by and large, in the aesthetic sense of culture, that's not the case. But what has happened in our time is that culture, in the broader anthropological sense of the word, has become a terrain of potentially lethal contention, a zone of conflict. And that's very momentous development, because traditionally, for Matthew Arnold, for Ruskin, for Ned Coleridge, and the others, for Schiller, for Hölderlin, culture was an arena of unity, harmony, potential consensus. What happens in our own time is that culture shifts over from being part of the solution to being part of the problem. It itself becomes a language in which political ideas are fought for, articulated, framed, and so on. And where does that start in our century? It starts with the most wildly successful revolutionary movement that modernity has ever witnessed. Not socialism, not feminism, not anarchism, revolutionary nationalism, which in the mid-decade of the 20th century detached one society after another from erstwhile empires and transfigured the face of the earth. But for revolutionary nationalism, culture is the very language of conflict, identity, way of life, language, symbol, and so on. So culture in all of those senses became more important in our age. But, and I will end on this note, apologies for going on for so long, but as a good old-fashioned materialist myself, I don't believe that culture in the end is where it's at. There is a postmodern doctrine that one could call culturalism, in which culture goes all the way down. It's wall to wall, as it were. Everything is culture. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Culture is important enough, as I say, to be what people are prepared to die or kill for. But even so, this is part of the difficulty of getting it to focus as a concept, even so, it doesn't go all the way down. It's almost impossible not to either overestimate or underestimate the importance of culture in the broad sense. And in that, it's rather like sexuality. It's very difficult. It's something to do with the phenomenon itself, not just our own, lack of ability, but one either, it's very hard to get it into proportion, to get it into focus. Yeah. However, let me just end by saying this. I don't think that the nature of people is culture. I think culture is of our material nature, which is a different formulation. And I think Marx believed that. Marx had a kind of materialist version of human nature, which he called Species-Wesen, Gattungswesen in German, for which culture is something that we need for our survival, quite literally. I mean, culture in the broad sense is something we need for our survival. We are all, as Jacques Lacan would say, born prematurely. All births are premature births, human births are premature births. We're all born entirely helpless and vulnerable, unable to take care of ourselves, and unless a system of culture in the sense of kinship and nurture and so on moves in on us straight away, we will surely die. We are not fortunate enough to be able to get up, lick ourselves down, rise shakily on our legs and trot off into a little distance, what was the case with some other animals. We're born with a huge hole in our nature where culture has to be. But that is a function of the kind of material animals that we actually are. Yes? Culture is of our nature. Unless one of those faces around the cradle speaks to the child, it won't become a person at all. It won't become a subject at all, because of course to be a person is a relational concept. It will be human, to be sure, because that's a matter of the kind of body it has which ties it into a certain species. Yes. We all have to make a precarious transition from simply being human to becoming personal, or if you like, from nature to culture. And if Sigmund Freud and a number of other thinkers are to be believed, most of our problems start here, because none of us will ever be able to negotiate this transition with complete success. What it will show us, however, is how radically dependent human beings are. That the blasphemous and hubristic individualist ethic, by which the most important aspect of human beings is their autonomy, their self-determination, their freedom from determination, which has poisoned the ideological atmosphere of the West for so long, is radically mistaken on this theory. Our dependency is far more radical than our independence, and whatever independence we can negotiate for ourselves, which will always be partial and flawed, has to be within that context. Thank you very much.
Question-answer session. I'm sure Professor Eagleton will be pleased to answer your questions. We haven't scripted this part very well, so we don't have microphones that we can run around with. I'm assuming all of us, we can hear each other and it should work fine. Any questions? Lots to think about. Yes. Michael.
When you were speaking, you were talking about, you mentioned the privatization of poetry. I'm wondering what you were referring to when you said that.
Yes. Poetry was privatized at a certain point, though won't read about that in the Wall Street Journal. I mean that somewhere, let's say, somewhere in between Shelley and Byron and, say, early Tennyson, just speaking now in English terms, many other terms, something of that kind happened to poetry. Poetry was no longer really a public discourse. There was a new, whereas for someone like Blake it's very hard to discriminate between what is poetic, ethical, political, and so on. There's a new carving up of discourses, a new division, as it were, of discursive labour, whereby, among other things, the novel takes over, the realist novel, takes over as the public form par excellence, yes, and then poetry becomes defined, even today, I suppose, to some extent, as that which is inward, subjective, emotional, lyrical, solitary, which of course becomes a mighty surprise to, Dante, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Poe, Johnson. That's a very, very recent definition of poetry. But I think that by the time of early Tennyson, let's say, that's set in. Mentioning Tennyson in memoriam was perhaps, you might say, the last great public poet. Queen Victoria's favourite bedside reading or something. And yet in memoriam really is a collection of deeply private lyrics. What happens then, I suppose, in this very quick, potted history of English literature, what happens with modernism, and let's say with the cantos or the wasteland, is an attempt once again to make poetry into a major genre at about the time when the novel itself, think of Woolf, is becoming more private, more subjective. So that's really what I meant by the privatization of poetry, which goes along with a certain notion of a certain kind of psychology, a certain psychology.
Yes.
You said one of the traditional roles of criticism is the workings of language. Could you maybe connect that a little bit to culture, what you talked about at the end about culture and how that affects the other?
Well, in the sense that language is the great medium of culture, isn't it? I mean, the point about language is it's always about more than itself. To speak of language is to speak of more than language, yes. As Wittgenstein would say, to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life, which the language crystallizes. So that to attend in that vigilant kind of way to the workings of language in a, let's say, literary text, is in itself to be doing something of broader cultural and even political significance. Think of the example I mentioned just en passant, the Cambridge School of Criticism. For somebody like Leavis or I. Richards or William Empson, a sensitive attention to the words on the page is not an alternative to a concern with the health of a whole culture, or the lack of health of it. It's a supreme index of it. You find the same with, say, Orwell, many English thinkers of that period. These two things are not, so that there's a sense in which simply by virtue of attending with a certain kind of vigilance to that quality of language, you are ipso facto engaging with wider issues, because there's no way of attending to language, properly understood, which isn't a way of attending to language. If formalism, as it were, may try to limit that off, but it keeps breaking out.
You mentioned that the argument about literature that it helps us understand how others feel isn't necessarily going to change our morality.
Yeah.
What about the possibility that literature helps us understand what we feel ourselves, and whether that has more impact than understanding others?
Yes. That's very interesting. And that assumes, doesn't it, interestingly, that we don't always know how we feel, which would have come as quite a surprise to certain traditional thinkers, for whom others might be alien and cryptic to us, but at least we're present to ourselves in some spontaneous and transparent way. Late modernity, let's say from Nietzsche and Marx to Freud and others, casts grave doubt upon that assumption, isn't it? He says that the human animal is desperately opaque to itself. It doesn't know what it desires. It can't answer with any degree of assurance that age-old question, the moral question, which of course is, what is it to live well? What is it to live fulfilledly and happily? In order to answer those questions, the last thing we can do is just look into our heart and see. When we look into our hearts, how do we know what we're finding there? Only, you might say, because we belong to a public language, which provides us with the concepts by which we identify what we feel and so on. So that that whole model, I think, collapses gradually in late modernity. One of the reasons why we need discourses like moral philosophy or political theory is exactly because we just have interminably to talk about those issues. What counts as happiness? What counts as fulfillment? If we were had intuitive and spontaneous access to ourselves, in the sense that we could rely upon our intuitions in those matters, we wouldn't really need those kinds of discourses. And lots of people would be out of a job, even have some people here. So the very fact we have those ways of talking is itself symptomatic of a certain self-capacity. Mind you, sorry to go on so long, but the other side of that coin is that for some of the thinkers I just mentioned, for example, Nietzsche, Freud, that self-opaqueness is also in a way necessary. Nietzsche would say it is by oblivion that we can be the thinking, feeling, acting creatures that we are. If we were to contemplate for a moment that enormous mound of wreckage and misery which goes under the name of human history, we would be paralyzed in Hamlet-like in our activity. Freud, in a way, is arguing that, repression is good for us. I mean, too much repression will make us ill. It will make us ill of unstaunchable longing, ill of desire. It is possible to fall ill of desire. Yes, desire is not a nice thing at all, whatever the romantic magazines might say. But nonetheless, though we can always have too much repression, for Freud, a certain amount of repression is necessary for us to be the walking, talking people that we are. An enormous paradox. The scandal of Freudianism is not infantile sexuality, which lots of people knew about, not least infants, for a very long time. The scandal of Freud is that we become the subjects that we are only on the basis of an enormous, traumatic and shattering repression of much that goes into our making, from which, moreover, we will never entirely recover.
Thank you.
I'm very interested in the connection between language and culture. What if a person, say, autistic, nonverbal, who has no way of communicating? How is a person in that situation affected by culture? I'm just curious on your thoughts on that. For a person who cannot communicate, has no ability to sign language, and is just enclosed in his.
Yes, I mean, language here is a shorthand really for forms of communication, which would include many. The body itself is a form of communication, and the body is kind of silent, really. I don't want to restrict that to language in the literal sense yet. Also, it may be one of the great mistakes of the 20th century thought that it may be that we've overemphasized the constitutive nature of language in terms of our experience. That's to say, it's clear that you don't need language to have experience. Anybody who's got up to a small child at 2 o'clock in the morning is well aware that you can have experiences What it doesn't have is the conceptual apparatus that language will give it to identify its experiences. Yes, that's what language brings you, which is obviously very useful. But it is not the case, of course, that language and experience are synonymous or identical. It's also the case, of course, isn't it, that other animals have rudimentary sign systems, at least rudimentary, and even though Wittgenstein didn't believe that dogs could hope, Wittgenstein didn't think a dog could have hope. Yes, that's surely not true, is it? Wittgenstein says, through this sense, a dog can't hope that its master is coming back next Wednesday at 3:15. No, a dog can't hope that. And the fact it can't is connected with its lack of language. It doesn't have the concept of next Wednesday at 3:15. Yes, a dog can't hope to have a quiet candlelit dinner with Scarlett Johansson. I don't wish here to unwittingly betray anything of my own psychology. Yes. But a dog can hope somebody will throw it a bone. It depends on the size of it. To have sizable realities of that kind may well depend upon a certain conceptual intricacy. But there are forms of desire and hope that are more immediately tied to our bodies. An animal, the other animals, non-linguistic animals, are animals whose traffic with their environment is primary bodily. Yes. And language isn't just something that you super add to that. Language then transforms all that. It makes all the difference to that. Yes. Nevertheless, we can speak of other languages as I say, of having rudimentary sign systems. And don't forget that in saying this, one is by no means being patronizing to other animals. For this reason, that of course language is also our disaster. It may represent our edge over, squirrels and badgers and so on, who don't seem to have the most exciting of lives. Maybe I'm being odiously paternalist to the rest. But, it's also our disaster. Badgers and squirrels are not engaged in creating cruise missiles, unless they're being very furtive. Hiding it from our view. They have a secret code. Language allows us to extend our bodies in all kinds of disastrous ways. Fox television, for example. Civilization is a complex extension of our bodies. But there comes a point where we can extend our bodies beyond our control. Yes? And then we may be in trouble. That's why we speak of the other animals as not being fallen. Not being fallen. Squirrels are not fallen. Yes. The human animal is fallen, but of course don't forget that the fall is traditionally, theologically, Felix fall. Happy fall. Fall up, or fall down. Or fall down to the beasts. Beasts are okay by and large, stay away from tigers and so on. But to fall up is to fall up into a realm of history, language, culture, civilization, which means our lives are far more exciting than those of badger, unless again they're being very quiet about it. But also far sickeningly precarious and unstable and unpredictable and so on. Language is blessing and curse simultaneously.
Yes, Jonathan.
It seems like you alluded to, it says outright, but culture is basically supplanting religion.
Sorry.
Culture is basically supplanting religion, replacing religion. I was just going to ask, when we're actually studying literature, what do you think we're missing out on if we don't take into account the beliefs of that time period? Because it seems like it was more important for reading a Victorian text. It seems like religion is more important to them than it is to us now. So how important is it to understand what they actually believe in?
I think there were two questions there. One is about culture and religion. And I didn't say, I mean, culture was a powerful attempt to substitute for religion, which I think on the whole didn't work out, precisely because of the enormous symbolic power of religion. Indeed, what we've seen in our own day with, say, Islamism, is that it's very hard to make that separation between culture and religion. It's a feature of Western enlightenment that you try and separate these spheres. But that's not the case with Islamism, or indeed the case with Western fundamentalism. As far as the, yes, of course, we have to take into account the beliefs in formula, the text we read, as you say. Although the Victorians, as far as the Victorians are concerned, of course the Victorians were desperately worried about religion, desperately worried, with creeping secularization of all kinds. But actually, I think they were, in a certain interesting sense, mistaken to be so. For this reason, the Victorians were worried that if you kicked away transcendence, you would bring morality clattering to the ground. And if you bring morality clattering to the ground, you will bring political order and stability with it. It was a political thing. It wasn't just there was atheism on the scene, the working class was on the scene. A new alarming industrial actor threatening its political order. Victorians have, I think, were mistaken about that. Morality in modern advanced capitalist societies doesn't need, in my view, transcendence. Doesn't need. Political order doesn't need transcendence. It can simply be based upon, upon various forms of secular morality. There seems to be no reason at all, in my view, why it couldn't be the case that advanced capitalism might go entirely secular. America, once again, is a special case, is an exceptional case given your history, your religious history and so on. But it seems to me in general, European capitalism is pretty godless. Not only that, faith is not good for capitalism. Faith is good for capitalism in the early years when it's building itself up, the years of the 19th century. It needs some grandiose notions like progress and liberty and so on. Advanced capitalism, faith is at best an embarrassment, and also kind of, it's really surplus to requirements. It's not faith that pins advanced capitalism together, as it pins, the Boy Scouts together, or the Lutheran Church together. Advanced capitalism is an inherently faithless order. Whatever people believe, I mean, it could be stuffed with born-again evangelicals, but the fact is, the marketplace is profane, pragmatic, materialist, rationalist, secular place, in which faith has, that kind of no real point. And the fact that one aspect, disastrous aspect of late capitalism, postmodernist capitalism, is it actually mistakes conviction for dogmatism. So little does it understand faith that any kind of conviction becomes ipso facto dogmatic, which of course is the reason why young Americans say like every 4 seconds. Because to say it's 9 o'clock is unpleasantly dogmatic and authoritarian, but to say it's like 9 o'clock is suitably tentative, provisional, open to revision, and so on. Capitalism has a problem with faith, and that is a real problem at moments of crisis when it needs some pretty firm foundations. And the problem since 9/11 is that Western capitalism is now confronting eyeball to eyeball a full-blown metaphysical enemy, namely radical Islam, for whom faith is no problem at all, for whom absolutes, metaphysical foundations, and so on, absolutely near the name of the game. At the very moment when Western capitalism had disarmed itself ideologically in its triumphalism after the Cold War, we no longer needed grand narratives, we could get by with pragmatism, relativism, hedonism, and so on. At that very moment, 2 aircraft slammed into the World Trade Center. And one of the great ironies of history opened up a huge grand narrative at the very moment when the West, in its arrogance and triumphalism, had thought we had closed down grand narratives.
Professor Joe Baker.
One thing I absolutely agree with you is somehow there's become this great distinction between being an academic and being an intellectual. So I have the notion that, do you want to be called a literary critic? Because if you're called a literary critic, my tendency is to believe that you're going to be more toward the academic. Is there such a thing as a disposition toward criticism that would make you a more effective critic of literature, even if you've read less of it, because maybe you know something about buildings, or maybe you know something about paintings? Is there some general sense of criticism or disposition toward it which can remedy that distinction between academic and intellectual?
A quick point about the category of intellectual. People sometimes talk about public intellectual, don't they? I think that's actually a tautology. I think that one way in which academics are distinguishable from intellectuals is that intellectuals properly understood are public figures. Public intellectual is a tautology, just as, say, business ethics is an oxymoron. Now, addressing your question more directly, yes, of course, if we look at the history of criticism, if we look, say, at Samuel Johnson, if we look at the 18th century, if we look at the vital role criticism played in the formation of manners and morals and the whole civilized form of life and so on, a kind of mini public sphere, then criticism was not academic, at least not, certainly not within the universities. Criticism enters the universities, of course, very late in Europe. So yes, criticism has a long public and social history before it is, as it were, narrowed to its present academic proportions. Samuel Johnson, I mean, you want to speak about Johnson or Hazlitt or Coleridge as intellectuals, you know, in that public activist sense, but there are also critics in the age before criticism becomes professionalized. And that's a very important narrative. At a certain point in the late 19th century in Europe, criticism becomes professionalized and academicized. In some ways that's a gain. It becomes less of a grandly abstract and amateur discourse of a Matthew Arnold kind. But it, you know, like a lot of gains, it also has attendant losses.
Interestingly, I just found out that Samuel Johnson not only was interested in architecture, but that he had advised some of the 18th century architects on some bridges, building of some bridges, which, a small point, but yeah, the idea of the intellectual in the 18th century. Professor Alan Spector?
Yeah, every time you comment, forces me to change yet another set of questions or thoughts I had. Go another direction. Let me just toss out some thoughts or impressions I have.
Alan, a little bit louder so folks
Sure.
at the back.
Usually people tell me I talk too loud. Let me toss out some impressions rather than simple questions that you sort of stimulated in terms of the thinking about all this. First of all, it seems that what many of us are trying to do is really overcome called false contradictions or dualism in thinking. And there's a famous quote, I forget who said it, that if you can, the rulers would like to make their ideology feel natural, because if you can make it feel natural, then you no longer have to prove anything to anybody. And dualistic thinking, whether it's mind, body, or morality and practicality, feels natural because it's easier. You don't have to work very hard at looking at the interconnections between, in fact, the mutual saturation of these separate concepts. But you can just sort of grab onto one and then have peace. So that, for example, when you talk about Marx and religion and God, one could argue that I do a little puzzle with my students. I give them a 10-question quiz, and tucked away in the middle of it is the world would be a better place if goods and services were distributed to people according to their needs, rather than according to their wealth. And then I announced cheerfully that 90% of them agree with Karl Marx on that particular one. And when I asked them to envision heaven, because Indiana is a very religious state, they invariably come up with something quite similar to what Marx talked about, a post-commodity society, where your needs are taken care of and you're free to flower in whatever mental, physical, psychological, intellectual way. But there are contradictions inside of contradictions. So, for example, I guess I would think that the pragmatism of capitalism, which is sort of based on division of labor, the pragmatism of capitalism is so pragmatic that it's willing to use dogmatism. That sounds contradictory. But in other words, to take what you said and extend it further, the idea that there's a selfish gene becomes a kind of rather superficial, supercilious form of theology, almost self-referential, and that becomes a justification for free market gone wild. But when you reference nationalism, for example, one could argue that keeping it on the back burner, that various modern regimes, whether you want to call them capitalists or not, are willing to utilize nationalism in particular as the metaphysical bond, which is actually artificial, to try to bind people together. So I guess what I'm saying is I agree with what you said about there is no core morality glue that underlies things together. But on the other hand, true pragmatism is willing to not even be pragmatic sometimes if it needs foot soldiers. So these are just some thoughts that you just raised. I don't really have any questions or answers.
Very, very quickly on 2 or 3 of those points. I am skeptical of the idea that all, you may not believe this yourself, that all ideology is inherently naturalistic. I don't think it's true. I think it's not a sufficient or comprehensive definition of ideology. Certainly the case that some ideology, quite powerful forms of ideology, naturalize and universalize and so on, but not all ideology does that. And I think we're in danger of straw targeting ideology if we think it does. It's perfectly possible to say, you know I'm an incurable little petty bourgeois, and I just like wearing these very tight suits or something. It's possible that ideology can be self-reflexive to a certain degree, and it can be self-reflexive in disarming ways.
Right.
Yes, it's not that ideology is always blind to what it is. As Chomsky once said, I think, one of the things wrong with the old cliche that the intellectual tells the truth to power is power knows the truth anyway. Yes. We shouldn't be so charitable to power that we think it's blundering around in a well-meaning but self-deceived way. So I think that would need some refining. On the question of dualism, I'm certainly a dualist. That's to say, I believe that there are tensions and contradictions built into our very material existence, whereby we're always, out ahead of ourselves, or lagging behind ourselves, or exterior, which are not resolvable in some kind of harmony or unity. I think it's very important to keep that situation open. Finally, just a question about religion. Famous, of course, everybody knows that Marx said, religion is the opium of the people. Actually, today, well, at least in Europe, at least where I come from, he's wrong. The opium of the people is not religion, it's sport. Sport is it. And you have here, that false god as well. It's an enormous industry. What on earth does the system do without sport? Without its weekly liturgies, its pantheons of mystical heroes, its symbologies and ceremonies and so on. Sport is the opium of the people. But the second point I want to make about it, when Marx said religion was the opium of the people, he wasn't, of course, simply speaking pejoratively.
Right.
I mean, what's wrong with a little opium? Not least if you've been working 20 hours a day in a factory, which is exactly as you know what he's talking about. Moreover, in the passage from which that phrase is usually rudely extracted, he says, religion is the heart of a heartless world. It is the soul of souls conditions. It is the opium of the people. Yes, it's an oasis of perhaps unrealizable value in a society which has been deprived of that kind of value. It's worth remembering that.
Would you like to take a couple
Yes.
more? Professor David Detmer.
Another question about the intellectual academic distinction you were talking about. And you mentioned the increasing specialization of so much scholarly work. And I suspect you would agree with me that one problem with that is most significant human problems are interdisciplinary in character. So, for example, something like global warming, there are all sorts of scientific aspects, economic, political, moral. So to think about it, one needs to cross these boundaries. So it's almost as if, not that I think this has happened, but the results are almost as if there was some kind of conspiracy to make intellectuals or academics impotent and ineffective by this sort of specialization. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts as to what the mechanisms are. Why is it that scholarly work is increasingly specialized? What makes that happen?
Yes. Well, a long story, but partly what I talked about in terms of the late 19th century professionalization of academic discourses, which is also accompanied by specialization. You begin at the end of the 19th century in Britain to get the first specialist journals, Mind and other such. A new conception of what academia is, a new kind of intellectual technocracy, as it were, is there, violently reacting against what it sees as the amateurism of the Victorian sage. But you're quite right, of course, today all the most interesting work is being done on the frontiers between different disciplines. We're in a sort of meltdown situation, I think, as far as that's concerned. I was once greatly complimented by a bookseller who told me that I was a bookseller's nightmare. But that's not just true of me. I mean, it's true of an increasing amount of work, isn't it? That the old academic categories don't really hold water for a lot of those creative work at precisely the moment when, for the technocrats and the bureaucrats, those frontiers are rigorously delimited. And so on. So we have to look at the uses of knowledge and functions of knowledge within the society as a whole. But I think what we're saying, although indeed it's not conspiratorial, well, let's not be too sophisticated about conspiracies. Of course there are conspiracies. It's just that there's not one big conspiracy, because it doesn't need to be. But do people get together in smoke-free rooms to plot the downfall of others all the time? Yeah. There's not one big conspiracy, but there's certainly a large number of small ones. But yes, it's as though intellectual life is being disempowered by its increasing technocracy at the very moment where history is posing to us issues which can't be tackled simply by one kind of language, by one way of speaking.
Yes.
Are you, being a literary critic, a public intellectual or an academic?
Well, I would like to think I was a public intellectual. I certainly spent a lot of time on the hoof around the world talking to various sorts of meetings, and not only academic, political meetings as well.
So you accept the slavery?
Oh yes, I love labels. I always puzzle by these liberals who say, "Oh, I don't like being labelled. I'm myself." Uniquely interesting. So you're not an anti-racist there. I mean, of course, nothing wrong with labels, as long as you don't mistake them for, as long as you recognise their limits. Yes, I would say that most of what I do is a public intellectual. I'm not really an academic any longer. I've been for quite a while. I am a visiting professor at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom, but I'm only there for 3 days a semester, which is far too long. I tolerate it. I'm arguing for some more workable arrangement. 3 hours, perhaps. But they don't seem to be able to see that. So, but I do think, also, put it this way, one of the points about literary criticism is it lends itself to adjacent or other ways of talking rather more easily. It's congenial to other ways of talking. It continually blurs into ethics and politics and sociology and so on. And that is partly because literary criticism, the field of literary criticism, has always been, to put the point politely, of rather low definition. Which is to say, to put the point impolitely, nobody's ever been able to say what it is. I mean, what is a discourse that deals with everything from, dactyls to death, or the iambic pentameter to spiritual transcendence? Possibly, I suppose. But I think one reason why, as I was saying in my talk, at a certain point in the early 20th century, literary critics, now as it were, take up the baton of more general cultural and moral concerns, is because the area, given the fuzziness of its limits, is more hospitable to other ways of talking. So it was more easier for that.
Professor Eagleton, I wanted to return very briefly to an earlier point you made, which is not clear in my head. You talked about babies and bureaucrats, and I can't remember exactly how, the issue of the two ends of the spectrum, the use of language, I'm assuming, is what you were trying to communicate about the baby having perhaps primitive ability to communicate versus the bureaucrat who is seasoned and knows how to use language. Would that, and then you said later something about the lapse and fall and pre-lapsarian, and I was wondering whether then the baby might be conceptualized as being pre-lapsarian and the bureaucrat very post-lapsarian, and whether that presents some problems in the sense of the ways in which language then is used. I mean, are those the two polarities with lots of things in between?
Well, I didn't really mean that babies can't use language and bureaucrats can. I meant almost the reverse. Babies can use language and bureaucrats can't. In this sense, that language, the rudimentary sounds that these little creatures make, I wouldn't know. Those, although they're not yet semantic, they are certainly semiotic in the sense that they're an exploration of what you might call the sensuous materiality of language, which is an indispensable condition, a sine qua non, for language in its more developed, abstract, semantic, communicative. The baby, the babbling infant, is showing us the material substrate of language. As we then progress towards the bureaucrat, what happens is that language is robbed of its sensuous materiality. Yes? It becomes a merely anemic and bloodless mode of instrumental communication, and the enemy of that is traditionally known as poetry. Because poetry is that which tends to the sensuous materiality of the sign and tends to the semantic dimension, i.e. meaning, of the sign in terms of its sensuous particularity. And once a student of literature has been able to grasp that, I think he or she has cracked it. That's the crucial insight. So, yes, I mean, this is abstractions, of course, are necessary. But Marx is very interesting about abstractions. He says that the abstract is a simple category, and he talks of working one's way up from the simple abstract to the complex concrete. Now that is exactly the reverse of most empiricist ways of thought. The concrete is what we feel on the pulses, and then you derive or extract an abstract object. Not at all. Marx sees that abstraction is absolutely necessary as part of an abstract concept to go to help construct the concrete, a complex representation. And indeed, one of the many sins of postmodernism is its completely mistaken belief, in my view, that the abstract or the universal is ipso facto dominative, falsifying, and so on. You know, I mean, what would an Enlightenment revolutionary have thought about that? For him or her, particularity was part of the ancien regime, where whether you had value depended on who you were. What is the mind-blowingly revolutionary doctrine of bourgeois enlightenment? Anybody at all can be in on the arguments, regardless of whether they're the son of the count or the daughter of the duchess, purely, would you believe it, by virtue of their common humanity. Late capitalism, however, begins to generate a discourse known as postmodernism and other, which is deeply suspicious, which can only see the concept of universality or common humanity as ideological mystifications. Now, the fact that they are often enough used in that way is doubted without doubt, but it is very one-sided, I think, to imagine that concepts of universality or nature, or even, and this is really fighting talk, I will be run out of town no sooner than coming into even essence, you see. Karl Marx was a good old-fashioned essentialist, and John Locke, father of bourgeois liberalism, was an anti-essentialist, and Jeremy Bentham, father of the dominant Victorian ideology, utilitarianism, was also an anti-essentialist. The idea so glibly assumed by postmodernism, there's a direct relation between essentialism conservatism, anti-essentialism, radicalism cannot be historically validated. We have to think that through again.
It is rather superficial and limited. Yes?
Thanks. Speaking of postmodernism, I know some of your earlier works better than your more recent, and I think I was joking with my friends earlier this week that I was going to be disappointed if you weren't cranky, because you're so negative in the midst of postmodernism. But now you seem way more optimistic, at least in person, compared to writing. So I wonder if generally, as an intellectual historian, we think we're in a more optimistic turn. Are we done?
Oh, well, we might well be postmodernist, and there are many reasons for that, but one of them is 9/11. What I said, that the West now feels a need for much grander narratives and so on. Hence, for one reason, the rise of people like Richard Dawkins and my old Trotskyist comrade Hitchens. Once again, a rather sort of off-the-peg version of Enlightenment, speaking of reason and science and progress, all the concepts which ironically postmodernism had put under wraps are suddenly now once again on the agenda. And I do think that's something to do with the political situation. Whether I'm more hopeful, well, I've just written an extraordinarily intelligent and in fact really rather working genius, if I could just modestly call it that, called Hope Without Optimism. Optimism, I think, is silly. The optimist is somebody who thinks that things will work out well just because he's an optimist. That's a bit like thinking they'll work out well because you're an Albanian or something like that, because you part your hair down the middle. Optimism is irrational, but hope is a different matter. But hope has to reckon with its own possible ruin. The only hope at the end worth buying is tragic. I don't mean by tragic ends badly. Tragedies don't always end badly. Tragedy means that you have to be hauled through hell to get to where you want, or at least to contemplate the ruinous collapse of your hope. So hope is different matter.
Well, I think on that note, I love it. We didn't script that, and it worked out. We ended on hope. First, of course, I would like to thank Professor Eagleton for coming here and spending time with us, talking to us on a variety of subjects. But I would also like to take a quick minute to thank a couple of our graduate students who helped to put this together. Felicia Dieguez, who's not here because she's setting up the light refreshments outside, as well as Karen Schmidt. Both of them were an enormous help. Thank you all for coming, and please do come outside and mingle for a bit, chat some more, ask some more questions. Thank you. Thank you.